Thank you all for joining us again as we are back with the Mecklenburg Council of Elders Know Your Rights session. Now it's time for the Know Your Rights session part. And today we actually have the Charlotte's Public Defender's Office, and they're going to give us a little bit of knowledge. I'm going to pass the mic on over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Bilal El-Rahal, and along with my colleagues Emily Walwork and Elizabeth Gerber, we are three attorneys from the Public Defender's Office here to talk to you about Know Your Rights. Our office is right uptown beside the courthouse, and we are easy to find online, and we are always trying to be a resource for the community, and we are thankful to the Council of Elders for being able to give this presentation and to kind of give some information about knowing your rights. So thank you very much. We'll go ahead and get started. Yeah, thank you. So we are here to talk about your rights and how to safely express them in your interactions with the police. They are your best tool for protecting you when you work with the police, and it's something that is really important for you to know. The police get legal training from attorneys about your rights, and we think you need to get legal training about your rights as well, and that's why the three of us are here to talk to you about that. When you are out and interacting with police, we all know the only thing you can control is what you do. You can't control what the police do, and we can't, unfortunately, make them do right all the time. The only way to make them do right is going to be major police reform. That kind of reform is things like holding police officers accountable, firing them, not just transferring them to other departments, making complaints public instead of hiding disciplinary records. That kind of reform is what's going to end up making police officers do right. But as far as you and me and your average people, when we're out in the street, all we can control is what we do. So we're here to talk to you really about three main things that you can do. Number one, always make sure to ask if you can leave if you feel like you want to leave. Always ask if you have to do what the police are asking you to do. And third, know the difference between legally refusing to cooperate and illegally resisting arrest. Those three things will protect you the most, and we are going to talk to you more about them in depth. We're not saying one bit that if you know your rights, you are not going to be mistreated by the police. If the police did what they were supposed to do, they wouldn't have community conversation teams that get sent out to make good with the community. If the police did what they were supposed to do, a lot of my clients wouldn't have to make a trip to the hospital on the way to jail after they've been arrested. If the police did what they were supposed to do, George Floyd would be alive, Breonna Taylor would be alive. If CMPD did what they were supposed to do, Keith Lamont Scott would be alive, Dankers Franklin would be alive. We're not saying that if you know your rights, all of those things would be better. But this is information that you need. It's information that can equip you, and it's tools that can protect you, particularly later in court. Now, considering a lot of these greater conversations nationally, we're going to move on to our first topic, which is protesting. Protesting is something that's been happening all around the country now, and it's happening here in Charlotte and is a big part of what we're starting to see at the Public Defender's Office when it comes to interactions between the people and the police. The right to protest is something that the Constitution and the Supreme Court have always deeply recognized. Protest is what makes the people's voices heard, and you know it's a lot of times the last resort or close to the last resort to really make change happen. There are two main components, I guess legally speaking, that you need to know about when it comes to protesting. Number one, the government cannot regulate what you say. If you want to make a sign and you are going to a protest that's approved, or you are going to somewhere that you know you can protest, the government can't regulate you based on what you want to say. Just because somebody doesn't agree with what you're saying is not a reason to try to silence you, and it's not a reason to try to change what you're saying. However, what the police can do and what the government can do is they can regulate how you say certain things. They can regulate the time, they can regulate the place, and they can regulate the method that you get your message across. Not based on what you're saying, but just based on how you're doing it. If you can see it in the example here, we have what looks like maybe a court building, a courthouse, or a government center building. You know, there are going to be limitations on some of those places based on how you're protesting and not necessarily based on what you're saying. Next, we're going to get into kind of the practical effects, not the practical effects, but the practical concerns you have when you're deciding to protest and how to do it in a way that best protects yourself.
Okay. Hi, so I'm Emily, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the practicalities of protesting in Mecklenburg County. So the Mecklenburg County, the Charlotte City Code of Ordinances does regulate how we can protest peacefully in Charlotte. And what it says is that we are allowed to protest without a permit on sidewalks, in public parks, and in government buildings. Depending on how large the size of your gathering is, this may require prior approval. Things that we want to make sure that people are aware of are ways that you can run afoul of the law unintentionally. Number one is noise. We want you to be careful of using speakers or other megaphones, because if you get above a certain decibel amount, you could be in violation of noise ordinances. Again, as I said, depending on the number of people, you may be required to notify the chief of police of the size of your gathering. And we have to be careful. We see a lot that in protest, one of the most powerful forms of protest is to walk in the road. CMPD does have the ability to charge that as impeding traffic. They have been, at least in our experience, allowing marching in the road, particularly with large crowds, in a reasonable manner. So you will see sometimes police officers blocking certain lanes of travel that they don't want the pedestrians to walk on. We've certainly seen police officers blocking the highways when pedestrians try to get onto those. But that's just something to be very careful of, is that CMPD does allow that within their discretion as a form of peaceful protest, but you have to be careful not to run afoul of the directions that they're laying out. Okay. We want to give some brief pointers on what to bring to a protest. What to bring has been put forth a lot on the internet, and this list comes a lot from there, but we want to make sure that you bring water. Protests are often long and crowded and hot. You want to use the buddy system. Have somebody with you who knows where you are. You want a form of identification. Mask or safety goggles are helpful in the event that chemical agents are used on the crowd. A lot of people rely on their cell phones for not just recording and taking pictures, but also staying in touch and letting people know that you're safe. If you're out for a long time, a portable charger may be helpful. We recommend some first aid items. We've actually seen a lot of people out with first aid available to the crowd, but that's something to think of. And an extra set of clothes in your trunk in the event that chemical weapons are used on a crowd. You may carry that in your clothing, and you'll want to change at the first available opportunity. But some things that are not being put out as much that we want to emphasize are things that you don't want to bring to a protest. You absolutely do not want to bring a firearm, even if you have a permit to carry concealed. There are regulations in the state of North Carolina that make it unlawful to carry any firearm at a protest. Even if you have a carry concealed permit, that is against the law. We have seen that this has not been enforced uniformly. We've all seen the photos of protesters on the steps of the North Carolina State Capitol with AR-15s. They were permitted to make that kind of protest without law enforcement interference, whereas we see people here in Mecklenburg County getting arrested for carrying handguns. But regardless, it's not allowed for anyone. We'll talk more about carrying concealed weapons later in the presentation, but we want to make everyone aware that carrying a concealed weapon is an extremely broad statute, and such that you can be in trouble for even small items if they are not being carried openly. This includes pepper spray. If it's in your purse or your pocket, that is technically carrying a concealed weapon. This includes pocket knives if they're larger than a very small size, and this can include things like brass knuckles. Anything that's concealed that could be used as a weapon could get you in trouble, and we'd recommend that you leave those items at home and don't bring them to a protest. We also recommend, certainly, that if there's something that you don't want the police to find, that you leave that at home. Any contraband items are not something that you want to take to a protest. And finally, we see a lot of advice about turning off either your face recognition or your fingerprint recognition and location tracking on your cell phone. Police should not be able to access any of that information without a search warrant, but it's still better to be safe than sorry. Okay. And as I said, the City of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County, they have regulations about the ways to safely and lawfully protest within the City of Charlotte and the County of Mecklenburg. Those are codified, and those are available on the internet at a website called MuniCode, and we put that link here, but if you go to municode.com, you can search for the Charlotte Code of Ordinances. And I'm going to pass this off now to Elizabeth Gerber.
Hi all, I'm Elizabeth. I'm also with the Public Defender's Office. What we've got here is we want to talk to you about the role of police at protests, because they're going to be there. For any protest of any type of size, you are going to see the police out there. That's normal and that's lawful, so we want to let you know kind of what you can expect from them. Like we said, they will be there. Officially, they're there because it's their job to protect and keep things safe, protect people from violence, and to protect property from damage. They're also there and they are allowed to corral the crowd. Like Emily mentioned, you'll often see during protests that they will block off particular streets. They'll try to sort of keep the march going in a particular circle around some blocks. And that is also allowed, that type of corralling and sort of redirecting of where the people are going. Please note that they sometimes do, we have seen in the past 2 weeks, they will mingle with the crowd, they will mingle with the protesters, some of them will march alongside of them. We also have some reason to believe that they might be out there in an undercover capacity as well, so just be aware of your surroundings and keep that in mind as you are out there exercising your First Amendment rights. I cannot emphasize this last point enough. Do not touch police officers. One of the more serious misdemeanors that we have in North Carolina is called assault on a government official. Assault on a government official, certainly if you punch an officer, you're going to be in trouble, but even if you so much as lay the tip of your finger on his shoulder, even just to get his attention, that would technically constitute the crime of assault on a government official. It will get you arrested and could get you convicted of a Class A1 misdemeanor. If you get convicted, that's probation, it's possibly jail, so under no circumstances should you bump them with your shoulder, touch them with your finger, have any physical contact with them at all. Now that rule does only apply to an officer who you can tell is an officer. If there's an undercover officer out there and he does not tell you that he's an officer, that rule is not going to apply to you. But if you have any reason to believe that someone does work with the police force, do not have any physical contact. You are allowed to record the police in North Carolina. North Carolina does permit this. They cannot order you to stop recording. They cannot seize your phone. They cannot seize the footage or order you to destroy that footage. There are some programs out there. We haven't personally used them, so we can't recommend any specific ones, but there are some programs out there that you can turn on so that if you're taking photographs or videos, it's sending it to the cloud or to a particular database as it's happening, so that even if something happens to your phone, that footage will be preserved. So it might be worth looking into some of those. Facebook Live is one example. A lot of people have been using that, posting things on Twitter and Facebook and keeping a live accounting of what is happening, what they are seeing on the streets. It's very important to keep in mind that you need to record from a safe distance, right? So that doesn't apply as much to the people that you're marching side by side with, but when you do come across a police officer, you can't get up in their face. If you do see a police officer having an interaction with another protester or civilian that you want to record because maybe you think it doesn't look right to you or you think it might go in a wrong direction in the future, you are allowed to record that, but don't get too close. If you get too close or otherwise interfere with what's going on there, you could be charged with what's called resist, obstruct, and delay. Avoiding unnecessary resisting and obstructing charges is one of the main goals that we have of this presentation. So it's not just if you're physically resisting being arrested yourself, it's also any kind of obstruction, even if it lasts for just a few seconds. So please be mindful of that, and if you are recording a police officer interacting with someone else, try to keep your distance from them, depending on the conditions that are around you. I can't tell you it's 2 feet or 5 feet or 10 feet, but use your common sense. Try not to actually interfere with what's going on, but do try to record it and preserve that information and that evidence. If you are detained or arrested, now you can be ordered to put your phone away, okay? So if you're just walking out on the street, you can record whatever you want. If you are yourself subject to a police encounter, which we'll talk a little bit more as we move forward, then you can be ordered in that situation to put your phone away and stop recording. So it's our recommendation, if you get a command like that, to comply with that command to avoid a resist, obstruct, or delay charge. We want you to remember that the police are probably also recording you. We've seen they, of course, have helicopters getting the big view. Most, but not all, of the officers at these protests are wearing their body cameras, and there may be other officers posted who are recording you in a place where it's not in your line of sight at that moment. So you can record them, but they can also record you, so be mindful of that while you're out there. We want to talk about dispersal orders. There's been a lot of conversation about this in the past couple of weeks, and what we want you to know is they can make these orders. If they make this order and you hear it, you are required to comply with it, or a couple of different things that could happen. So one sort of note that I want to tell you about this is some of this information we've got up here is based on CMPD's operating procedures and what CMPD believes it's allowed to do right now. Not all of this has come up for review by a court yet, so there may be challenges to it down the road, but you've got to know what to do tomorrow. So we want to tell you what CMPD's understanding is right now and what you can expect to see if you are out there protesting. So if CMPD declares that a protest is an unlawful gathering, it is time to leave. And they can declare that if they see any type of violence, even if it's a crowd of 300 people and one person throws a water bottle, CMPD could decide in its discretion that that's an unlawful gathering and issue a dispersal order. So we do recommend it's time to leave because this is important for your safety. Once they declare a protest is unlawful, they are allowed to use force to clear the crowd. They are allowed to use tear gas. They are allowed to use rubber bullets. They are allowed to arrest people who aren't leaving the scene, okay? So those are the things that could happen if you hear an order and you choose not to leave. CMPD is supposed to announce loudly enough for everybody to hear. It doesn't seem like that's always happening, but that is what they're supposed to do. You're not supposed to be held accountable for not following an order that you couldn't hear, so that's the obligation on their side. They're supposed to give people a chance to leave, and they're supposed to tell people which way to safely leave, right? So we've heard about some situations where possibly protesters were told to leave and they couldn't get out, they were blocked in on all sides. That is not how that is supposed to go. The way it is supposed to work is if they determine that a protest is unlawful, if they order the crowd to disperse, there's supposed to be an avenue for people to leave, and they're supposed to be given time to leave, time to comply. If you get arrested at a protest, you can be and probably will be handcuffed. Things can escalate quickly, so we just want to help you be prepared and think through some of the things that could happen. If you get arrested at a protest, you will be searched and you could be questioned. Now, if they ask for your name and date of birth, you do have to answer that question, but there are no other questions that you are required to answer. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to ask to speak to an attorney. We have to emphasize that it's important that you don't lie about your name or date of birth. Even a tiny, tiny thing like giving a different middle name could get you charged with giving false information to a police officer or resist, obstruct, or delay. So if they ask for your identification information, you have to give it to them and you have to be truthful, or you could be charged with an additional crime. You always have the right to contact an attorney. The officer does have the choice to release you with a citation. People call this a ticket, just give you a ticket and let you leave. But it's also their choice to put you in handcuffs and arrest you and take you downtown. You would come before a magistrate, and the magistrate would decide whether or not you're held in jail. When they schedule you for your first court date, that's the time when you would ask for a lawyer or tell them that you plan to hire your own attorney.
So we'll let you know. If the officer says yes, you do not have to give permission. And then it becomes an issue that we get to discuss and battle out, perhaps, in court later. If you give permission to the officer, there's no longer much of a question at that point for us to fight in court on whether that officer was allowed to do what he wanted to do. You gave permission. You never have to give permission. And if you want to know what kind of situation you're in, ask, am I free to leave? can I just leave, and do I have to? If the officer says no, you are always free to say no, and if the officer says yes, just let them know they do not have your permission. This slide really kind of encapsulates that idea of a consent search. Let's see what's in your pockets. Let's see what's in your bag, right? Can I search you? Sometimes they will just come out and ask you, and you may feel like you have to say yes. You never have to say yes. You can always ask, do I have to? Do I have to let you search? And if they say no, you can stop them right then. If they say that you don't have to let them search, but you decide to let them search, and halfway through the search, you change your mind, you can still say no. You can always stop in the middle of a search and say, officer, I've changed my mind. You no longer have my permission to search. You can always do that. If they continue to search, it becomes something that we can battle out in court. If they have your permission to search, there's much less for us to argue about in court on whether or not they had the right to do that. Again, this is kind of emphasizing that point of voluntary contact. Am I free to leave? Conversations and voluntary contact are extremely common. A lot of times officers will not have much to go on, and they will just be out in the community after getting a call for service or investigating and going up to people and just talking to them and starting conversations. That's fine, but if you're ever unsure or uncomfortable or you do not want to continue having that conversation, ask them directly, am I free to leave? Something that is effective in these situations is to put action with the words. Ask and back away. Ask and say, am I free to leave? Can I go, right? And that lets the officer know that you are serious about your rights and you are serious about giving them permission to either detain you or arrest you. Put some action with it. If you are free to leave and you are allowed to walk away, then you are okay to do that and to put action with that question. Now, a detention is that middle ground where you are not free to leave and you may not necessarily have to let them search. It is possible that what will happen during a detention is a pat down, and that is when an officer just uses their hands to pat you down generally to check for weapons. If you are detained, if you ask if you are free to leave and the officer says no, they do not have to ask you permission to pat you down. They could just do that. And it's important to know that you don't have to give them permission to do it, and they may do that regardless. This is another circumstance. It's the same as the voluntary contact, the same in this circumstance, and the same in arrest. You have the right to remain silent in all of these circumstances. You have to give your name and date of birth if they ask you for identifying information, but that stays the same throughout all three. You always have the right to remain silent, and you always have the right to ask to speak to an attorney. Finally, when you are under arrest, when you are in that last category and you are under arrest, number one, you've asked, am I free to leave? And they say no. And if you are under arrest, most of the time they will inform you you are under arrest. That will let you know kind of where you stand in relation to your rights. If you are under arrest, they don't have to ask your permission to search you. They might still ask your permission anyways. And it's our advice never to give them that permission. If they ask you permission to search and you give it to them, then even if it was a wrongful arrest, they might have been allowed to commit that search because you gave them that permission. So even if they say, we're going to search you anyways, but it'll be easier if you give us your permission, you do not have to give your permission. Not in a single circumstance do you have to give permission. And particularly if you are under arrest, the best way to protect your rights and to preserve your rights in court is to not give them permission so that we can examine it later, see if they had the right to do what they wanted to do to you. So finally, this kind of wraps up those three categories of where you can be when you interact with the police. You might be in voluntary contact, you might be detained, and you might be under arrest. It's hard to know on the street what exactly is going on. Ask the questions that we've been trying to give you. See if you can place yourself in a place that you can protect yourself and your rights, but it's absolutely okay if you are out interacting with an officer and you don't know exactly what is going on. Just remember, you never have to give them permission. You have the right to remain silent, and don't lie to the officers. That's just another thing that they will certainly use against you if they get the chance. So kind of what we talked about briefly earlier, the charge of resist, obstruct, and delay. The difference between refusing to cooperate, not giving your permission, which you are always allowed to do, and resisting an officer or obstructing an officer, which you are not always allowed to do and can result in an even additional charge. We have up here an example kind of, or something to talk about, the wobble, right? The wobble is when a person is under arrest, they have their hands behind their back, and you're moving back and forth, right? You're moving back and forth, you're frustrated, it is just a bad situation, you feel like it's unfair, and you're moving back and forth. You might have both of your hands behind your back, unlike me with the microphone. You are still going to get charged with resist for wobbling, for moving back and forth. Anything you do to make an officer's life any harder unlawfully is going to be charged as resist. But if you tell them, listen, officer, you do not have my permission to search, and they do it anyways, I do not want to be under arrest. You don't have to do the search for them. You certainly don't have to make things easy for them. But once you get into the line of any physical resistance, any pushing back or pulling away, anything that gets to be physical is just another charge for them to hit you with. And that's just another bond. It's just another way for them to potentially keep you in jail before your trial. It's just another way to make things much harder for you later on. So keeping in mind kind of the difference between lawfully refusing to cooperate and not giving your permission, but the difference between that and then illegally physically resisting, giving false information, anything like that can help protect you from being vulnerable to any additional charges being brought against you.
Okay, so just to sum up a little bit of everything that we've talked about so far, the most important things, again, that we want people to know is that it may be really unclear what situation you are in with a police officer during an interaction. And it might be so unclear that, again, we have to argue about it in court later. And though that is, that is the entire role of your defense attorney, of your public defender. What we argue about with prosecutors in front of judges all day, every day, are the lines between these three encounters, which one the police had the authority to be in, whether the police had the authority to do what they ask you to do, and whether anything that happened during those encounters, was enough to make it an arrest or was not enough and it should have been a voluntary contact. We argue back and forth between these boxes all day, every day, and that's why we have these lines that are split up, is because this is a fluid spectrum that is not always clear in the moment. The way that you can make it more clear for yourself is to ask, do I have to? Officer, do I have to let you search my purse? The officer might say yes. In that case, he's going to search the purse whether or not you hand it over. We recommend, again, at the point that he says, yes, you have to, we want you to hand it over. If you say to an officer, am I free to leave? And he says no, then you must stay. Because if you don't stay, you could get an additional charge of, how many times have we said at this presentation, resist, obstruct, delay. Things that we really find that can make people move from maybe a voluntary contact to a detention or arrest are things where people are not clear. So if, for example, an officer comes up, as officers are allowed to do, comes up and speaks to anyone on the street to engage them in conversation, an officer is allowed to do that even if he doesn't suspect you of any wrongdoing. But let's say, hello, how are you today? Do you mind if I search your purse, right? The officer has no reason to think that you have anything whatsoever in the bag. He just asks you, right? Do you mind? If you say, maybe even if you believe that you have to, yes, here you go ahead, and you have something in that purse you're not supposed to have, even ladies, pepper spray from riding the bus late at night, you can be in trouble for those items. And we don't have a legal recourse because you allowed the officer to search the purse, you gave your permission. Even if you don't know that you can say no, unfortunately, that's not a defense. So that's why we say to people, ask, do I have to? That way you will know. The officer is not permitted to lie to you about your constitutional rights. So if an officer says to you, yes, you have to allow me to search this purse, and that turns out to be not true, then your attorney later in court is going to argue that for you to keep that evidence out of court. Similarly, let's go in this sort of middle murky ground, a detention. Let's say an officer had a 911 call and says that you matched the description of somebody that they're looking for. The officer may detain you, which is that in between. You're not quite under arrest for whatever that call was for, but they're going to try to get some more information to see if you were involved. But during that detention, the officer has you in handcuffs. He's saying, just wait, we're checking on a few things. You're pulling away, right? Then all of a sudden the officer could find that you have resisted arrest, and then you've moved from them maybe not having anything on you other than matching a description to now that you've resisted being detained, you're in this arrest situation where they can again charge you with a crime of resist, obstruct, delay a public officer and search you, and then anything else that you may have on you is subject to search. One thing that we want to address that we hear all the time, I think is probably the most commonly known thing just from television, is my rights. They didn't read me my rights. And we want to address that. Not having your Miranda rights read to you does not mean that your case is going to get thrown out in court. What it means is that anything you said in this situation when you're under arrest, anything that you said under arrest when a police officer asked you questions, that gets thrown out. But everything else can come in. So if they have lots of other evidence other than your own words, not having your Miranda rights read to you does not get your case thrown out. We have talked a lot, and Bilal talked a lot about this resist charge. What I want to say about it is the resist, obstruct, delay charge is extremely broad. It can be defined, and we've referenced it many times, as basically anything that holds up a police officer or makes that job harder for them while they are doing a lawful police duty. That can include many things such as lying about your name. The time that it takes the officer to figure out your real name or date of birth is included in that delay. Pulling away from handcuffing, but also, one thing that Elizabeth talked about was getting too close to an officer. Say you're a civilian and you want to film a police officer arresting someone else. If that officer says you're too close, you need to back up, you must back up, because that can also be included in this charge. This is a very broad charge that we want to help people to avoid. So again, if an officer orders you to do something such as back up, what's your response? Do I have to? They say yes, back up. Again, so do I have to, am I free to leave? But also let's talk again about consent. Consent in itself means that you must give your permission. The number of times that we do these presentations with a live audience and ask someone, do you have to give consent? The answer is almost all of the time. People say yes, they believe that you have to give consent. That is not the truth. Consent means that you are giving your permission for a police action to search your person, to search your belongings, to search your car, sometimes even just to stay there talking to an officer. The law presumes that people know that you don't have to stay, and that's not part of the inquiry. So we want to make sure that you do know that you don't have to give permission to an officer, because the law assumes that you do know that. The other thing that we want to emphasize about consent is that a lot of times police officers will layer on a request of consent on top of an action that they're going to do anyway. So let's say an officer believes that he has probable cause to search your car. He may, even though he believes he has legal reason and justification to search your car, he may ask for your consent to sort of give himself an extra layer of protection, so that even if it comes out later and a judge finds he did not have probable cause to search, they still would be able to get in any evidence of anything they find in your car because you also gave consent. A lot of times, if an officer says, "Do you mind if I search this?" If you say no, they may search anyway, but you have done yourself and your lawyer in court a service by not giving the police an additional justification to search the car. We, again, recommend that you request an attorney as soon as possible and that you do not give a police interview without an attorney. We recommend that you don't give interviews to the police or the district attorney at all, but certainly not before you have had the chance to speak to an attorney. If you are just an observer, a community bystander, we want to make sure, again, that you record safely from a safe distance. We want to make sure that you get the officers' names and badge numbers. Police officers with Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department are required under their own directives to display their badge with a name and badge number. We have seen quite a lot, especially in their riot uniforms, that they are not wearing name badges at those times. So other ways that you can try to figure out who they are by making note of police car numbers or making note of simply where they are at a specific time. Because even if you cannot immediately identify them, CMPD dispatch should be able to identify police officers based on where they are at what time. And again, you are permitted under the First Amendment to peacefully express your dissatisfaction with police action.
All right, we've got just some final tips about some miscellaneous topics that sort of come up. We talked a little bit earlier about carrying a concealed weapon. The only thing we want you to keep in mind is that that's a lot broader than people think it is. So things that you might have for your own protection in your purse or your pocket could be illegal, so please keep that in mind. The fact that it's broader than people expect is one of the reasons why we've also emphasized over and over and over again that we do recommend not giving consent and not making statements. Because you might not realize that something that you have or something that you have done is actually illegal. So the best way to protect yourself is just not to give that permission and not to make that statement unless you've already talked to a lawyer about it. Marijuana and hemp is something we have on here. North Carolina did make hemp, which is a different plant from the marijuana plant, it made hemp legal. Marijuana is still illegal, but it is very, very difficult based on a visual inspection and based on smell, if not impossible, to tell the difference between these two things, one being legal and one being illegal. Now, if you make a statement saying, "Oh yeah, officer, that's my weed, but don't worry about it, it's just for personal use," now you have just confessed to a crime and you have given the officer the evidence that he needs to prove that that is marijuana, illegal, and not hemp, legal. So again, don't give consent, don't make statements unless you've spoken to an attorney first. That's how you protect yourself in that kind of situation. Citations is something that comes up. Some people say, "Oh, well, I haven't ever had any problems with crimes, I've never been charged with a crime, I just got a ticket, right? A citation can be a crime. Officers use citations, which is just that piece of paper where they fill out the name of the person and the time and what the offense is. Maybe it's a speeding ticket, but maybe it's possession of marijuana, maybe it's something else, maybe it's possession of an open container. They can use citations for crimes. So just because you were given a citation and not processed and taken into custody and going under arrest, you still could have been charged with a crime. Plain view. So officers typically, to do a search, they need to have either a warrant, right? They come to your house with a warrant, or they have a search warrant for your person. They can search you after an arrest, or they can search if something is in plain view. So if they are somewhere where they're allowed to be, like say it's a traffic stop and they've pulled you over, and then they see just the tip of a gun poking out from under a seat. Plainly, with their eyes, they now have some evidence that will let them search the car and try to determine if there's carrying a concealed firearm, right? If an offense is occurring, right? So if they can see something illegal in plain view, that also gives them cause to conduct an additional search and possibly detain you. We don't have this up here, but I want to say about detentions. Just because you are in handcuffs does not mean you are under arrest. You can be placed in handcuffs even during a detention. So that goes back to this whole idea that we've been repeating of the line between these categories is murky, and the only way to know exactly where you stand is by asking. So just because you're in handcuffs doesn't mean you're under arrest. The last thing we have up here is showing ID. Officers are allowed to ask to see your ID. If you're not driving a car, you don't have to give them your identification. You might have to tell them your name, but you don't have to produce a license. If you are the driver of a car, that's a privilege, not a right. So you do have to produce your license and prove to them that you've got the lawful permission from the state of North Carolina to be behind the wheel, to be driving. So in that situation only, you are required to produce your actual identification. So we've talked a lot about what you can do to protect yourself, and we've talked about some of the rules of the road here. We want you to have this information and know how to file a complaint. So if something happens to you or to someone that you know that you don't think followed these rules that we discussed, or even if it was behavior that felt unprofessional or like harassment to you, we do want you to be encouraged to file a complaint. You can phone it in, you can mail it in, you can file it online, you can go in person. You've got all of those options. So we are not claiming that if you file a complaint about behavior that officer is going to be immediately taken off the streets, suspended, fired, punished, charged with a crime. That's not the real world. That's not where we are right now. But if you file the complaints, and if your neighbors file the complaints, now we build a paper trail. Now we build a record, right? And it starts to build and build and build, and it becomes incontrovertible that officer needs to go or that department needs to change. So if you see something, say something. And this is how you file the complaint. We are the Public Defender's Office. If you have questions about this, even if you're not our client, you are welcome to call us. We have a website. It's mecklenburgdefenders.com. Our phone number is 704-686-0900. We hope to be able to do some of these with you live again, but we do thank you for tuning in today.